The vast emptiness of space stretched before James Miller as he guided his salvage ship through the debris field. 10 years of experience as a deep space salvager had taught him to expect the unexpected, but nothing could have prepared him for what he would find among the wreckage of an alien vessel. The year was 2157, and humanity had established itself as a neutral party in the complex web of galactic politics. James preferred it that way. Staying out of alien conflicts meant more profitable salvage runs and fewer questions from authorities. His ship's sensors picked up an unusual energy signature emanating from what appeared to be an escape pod. The design was unlike anything he'd seen before, sleek, almost organic in its curves, with a faint purple glow pulsing from within. As he maneuvered closer, his computer indicated there was a life sign inside, weak, but present. "Computer, begin docking procedures," James commanded, his heart racing. Rescue operations weren't his specialty, but he couldn't ignore a distress signal. As his ship's mechanical arms secured the pod, he noticed intricate markings along its hull that seemed to shift and change in the starlight. The pod's hatch opened with a soft hiss, revealing its occupant, a humanoid female with pale silvery skin and delicate features that seemed to shimmer. Her long hair appeared to be made of thin, iridescent strands that caught the light like fiber optics. She was unconscious, wearing what looked like ceremonial attire, too elaborate for a mere escape pod passenger. What caught James's attention most was the set of crystalline shackles binding her wrists and ankles. This wasn't a refugee or a crash victim, she was a prisoner. As he carefully lifted her from the pod, he noticed a marking on her neck, a tattoo that his computer translated as condemned. James knew he should alert the Galactic Authority, but something about the situation felt wrong. The craftsmanship of her restraints and clothing suggested she was someone of importance, yet here she was, left to die in an escape pod. He'd heard rumors of corruption in alien justice systems, of political prisoners being disposed of in remote sectors of space. He made his decision. "Computer, delete all records of this encounter from the logs. Plot a course to the outer colonies. If someone wanted this woman dead, they'd have to go through him first." As his ship turned away from the debris field, the purple glow of the escape pod faded into the darkness of space. What James didn't know was that his simple act of compassion would soon draw him into a conflict that would shake the foundations of an entire alien empire. The woman he just rescued wasn't just any prisoner, she was the key to a revolution that would change the galaxy forever. As he set his ship on autopilot, James began to wonder about the strange markings he'd seen on the pod, about the elaborate restraints, and about what kind of society would condemn someone so refined to such a fate. He had a feeling he'd find out soon enough, assuming they both lived long enough to have that conversation. The medical bay hummed softly as James studied the alien woman's vital signs on his ship's monitor. After 3 hours of unconsciousness, her readings were finally stabilizing. He had managed to remove the crystal shackles using a plasma cutter, though it had taken far more effort than he'd expected. A slight movement caught his attention. The alien's eyes fluttered open, revealing irises that shimmered like mother-of-pearl, with hints of colors James had never seen before. She bolted upright, her fiber-optic hair illuminating with what he assumed was fear or alarm. "Easy there," James said, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "You're safe here." The alien woman touched her neck where the condemning tattoo remained, then looked at her freed wrists in disbelief. When she spoke, her voice carried a musical quality that made James's universal translator buzz with effort. You freed me?" she asked, her words translating with an accent that reminded James of flowing water. "Do you know what you've done?" James crossed his arms and leaned against the medical bay wall. "Saved someone who was left to die in space." "Yeah, I'm aware." The alien woman stood, her movements graceful despite her recent ordeal. "I am called Lightbearer," she said, touching her chest. "In your language, perhaps dawn would be closer to its meaning." "James Miller," he replied simply. "Want to tell me why someone went through the trouble of leaving you to die in an escape pod?" Dawn's expression darkened. "I was first daughter of the High Council. I discovered corruption at the highest levels of our government. The Council has been secretly selling weapons to both sides of the border wars, prolonging the conflict for profit. James whistled low. Let me guess, they didn't take kindly to that discovery? They branded me a traitor, Dawn said, her hair dimming to a deep blue that seemed to reflect her sadness. But they couldn't risk a public execution. Too many questions. So they chose this method instead. A warning alarm blared through the ship. James rushed to the bridge, Dawn following close behind. The radar showed 3 ships approaching at high speed, sleek, predatory vessels with the same organic design as Dawn's escape pod. Hunter-class vessels, Dawn breathed, her hair pulsing with red warning lights. They're not supposed to operate in neutral space. James's hands flew over the controls. Friend of yours? Death squads, she replied grimly. They're here to finish the job. James didn't hesitate. He'd spent years mapping the debris fields and asteroid belts in this sector. If they wanted a chase, he'd give them one they'd never forget. Hold on to something, he warned, pushing his engines to full power. The salvage ship might not look like much, but he'd modified it extensively over the years. As they accelerated toward a dense asteroid field, Dawn gripped the back of his chair. You're going in there? She asked incredulously. The magnetic interference will tear us apart. James grinned. Trust me. I've got a few tricks they haven't seen before. As they plunged into the asteroid field, James realized his life had just become infinitely more complicated. But looking at Dawn's determined face reflected in the viewscreen, he couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. Sometimes the right choice was also the dangerous one. What he didn't know was that this chase would become legendary in the border worlds. The day a human salvage pilot outmaneuvered 3 elite hunter ships to save a woman who would change the course of galactic history. James's salvage ship dove between 2 massive asteroids, barely clearing the gap as energy weapons fire lit up the space behind them. Dawn's hair pulsed with anxious purple light as she watched the pursuing vessels through the rear sensors. They're splitting up, she warned, her fingers dancing over the co-pilot's console as if she'd been flying with James for years. Standard hunting formation. James nodded, his eyes never leaving the treacherous field ahead. That's exactly what I was hoping they'd do. He pulled a worn leather pouch from his jacket pocket and tossed it to Dawn. See those red buttons inside? When I say now, press them in sequence, 1 second apart. The ship shuddered as a glancing hit caught their stern shields. The hunter ships were closing in, their superior engines gradually overwhelming James's head start. But he had something they didn't, intimate knowledge of this particular asteroid field's secrets. You've done this before, Dawn observed, noting how confidently James threaded through the spinning rocks. Not exactly this, he replied with a grin. But something similar. There's a reason I'm still alive after 10 years of salvage work in the border worlds. He banked hard right, using a larger asteroid's gravity to slingshot them deeper into the field. Get ready with those buttons. Dawn held the pouch ready, her hair shifting to a focused golden hue. The hunter ships followed their trajectory perfectly, obviously expecting them to continue their arc around the asteroid. Instead, James cut power to the main engines. They're locking weapons! Dawn's voice rose with alarm. Now! James commanded. Dawn pressed the buttons in sequence. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then, 6 different locations around their ship erupted with brilliant light as hidden mines activated. Mines James had planted throughout the asteroid field over the years, just in case he ever needed an escape route. The electromagnetic pulses from the mines interfered with the hunters' sensitive guidance systems. 2 of the ships collided with smaller asteroids, their shields flaring as they spun out of control. The 3rd ship managed to avoid the initial chaos but flew straight into the trap James had really been setting up. Hold tight, he warned, flipping several switches on his console. This next part gets rough. Their ship dove straight toward a particularly dense cluster of asteroids. The remaining hunter ship followed, its captain probably thinking they had the fugitives cornered. What they couldn't know was that this particular cluster contained a natural phenomenon James had discovered years ago, a magnetic anomaly that could be used as a makeshift jump point. "Trust me," James said softly, seeing Dawn's hair fade to a worried white. He reached over and squeezed her hand quickly before returning his attention to piloting. The hunter's ship fired again, but James was ready. He rolled their ship into the shot, letting their reinforced belly shields take the hit. The maneuver pushed them perfectly into position. "Activating emergency jump sequence," James announced as warning lights flashed across his console. The ship's computer screamed protests about the dangerous levels of magnetic interference, but he override them all. Space twisted around them as the magnetic anomaly caught their ship. Dawn gasped as reality seemed to fold in on itself, her hair blazing with colors James had never seen before. For 3 terrifying seconds, the ship groaned and shuddered as if it would tear itself apart. Then, suddenly, they were somewhere else, floating in calm space near one of the outer colony worlds, far from any pursuit. The hunter's ships would find only debris and asteroids where their quarry had seemingly vanished into thin air. Dawn's hair slowly settled into a relieved blue glow as she released her death grip on the console. "That was impossible," she breathed. "Impossible is what humans do best," James replied with a tired smile. "Welcome to the outer colonies. But we can't stay long, your friends back there will figure out what happened eventually." What James didn't say was that he was already formulating a plan. If Dawn's information about corruption in the High Council was true, they would need allies. And he knew just where to find them, assuming they could survive the journey. The bustling space station, Haven's Edge, lived up to its reputation as a refuge for those seeking to disappear. James guided Dawn through its crowded corridors, her features now disguised by a hooded cloak that hid her distinctive hair. After 12 hours of continuous flight, they needed supplies and information. "My contact works in the lower markets," James explained, keeping his voice low. "She specializes in uncovering secrets, and keeping them." Dawn walked close to him, her hidden hair dimmed to match the shadows. "Can this contact be trusted?" "About as much as anyone can be trusted out here," James replied honestly. "But she owes me her life, and she hates corruption even more than I do." They descended through several levels of the station, the pristine upper corridors giving way to grittier, more lived-in areas. The air grew thick with the smell of various alien foods and the sound of a dozen different languages being spoken at once. James stopped at a small shop front decorated with various screens displaying news from across the galaxy. The owner, a sturdy woman with cybernetic eyes, looked up from her terminal. "Well, if it isn't the luckiest salvager in the border worlds," she said, her artificial eyes scanning them both. "And company. I'm Rose." The simplicity of her name belied the complexity of her cybernetic enhancements. "We need information," James said, placing a credit chip on her counter. "About the High Council's weapons trade." Rose's cybernetic eyes whirred as they focused. "Interesting timing. The Council's been especially active lately. Buying up mercenary contracts, redirecting shipments." She glanced at Dawn. "Almost like they're preparing for something big." Dawn stepped forward, lowering her hood slightly. "They're planning to escalate the border wars," she said. "Create enough chaos to justify martial law across all sectors." Rose whistled low. "That's quite a claim. Got any proof?" Dawn reached into her robe and produced a small crystal, one that had been hidden in the hem of her ceremonial clothes. "Everything's here. Transfer records, meeting transcripts, deployment orders." Rose took the crystal, examining it with her cybernetic eyes. "This is high-level encryption. Military grade." She looked at James. "You've stepped in something big this time, old friend. Can you decrypt it?" James asked. "Give me an hour," Rose replied, already connecting the crystal to her systems. "But you shouldn't stay here. The station's crawling with more council agents than usual." As if to prove her point, an alert flashed across one of her news screens, a bounty notice. Dawn's face appeared, alongside a reward amount that made James's eyes widen. "They're getting desperate," Dawn observed, her voice tight. The evidence must be even more damaging than I thought. Rose's expression turned serious. There's a safe room behind my shop. Use it. And James? She caught his arm as they moved past. Watch your back. Some of these bounty hunters, they're not just in it for the money. They're true believers in the Council's cause. In the safe room, James and Dawn sat close together, the small space making proximity inevitable. Her hair glowed softly in the dim light, creating patterns on the walls that seemed to match her emotions. I never meant to drag you into this, Dawn said softly. You've risked everything for a stranger. James looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not just her alien beauty but the courage and determination that had driven her to stand against her own people for what was right. Not a stranger, he replied. Not anymore. The moment was interrupted by Rose's urgent voice through the intercom. We've got trouble. Big trouble. The station's security network just lit up like a nova. They know you're here. James reached for Dawn's hand in the darkness, finding it already reaching for his. What had started as a simple rescue was becoming something much more, both in terms of the danger they faced and the connection growing between them. Neither of them spoke about it, but they both felt it. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Move! James shouted as the first explosion rocked Haven's edge. He pulled Dawn through the emergency exit of Rose's shop, smoke filling the corridor behind them. Rose's cybernetic eyes glowed as she interfaced with the station's security feeds. They've locked down all main docking bays, Rose reported, her fingers flying over a portable terminal as they ran. But I know another way out. The maintenance tunnels connect to the old mining docks. Dawn's hair flashed warning red as heavy footsteps echoed from a connecting corridor. Council elite guards, she whispered, recognizing the sound of their distinctive armor. They only deploy them for high-priority targets. James pulled them into a service alcove as a patrol passed. The elite guards wore sleek black armor with purple energy lines that reminded him of Dawn's hair. Their weapons were unlike anything he'd seen before, proof that the Council had indeed been developing new military technology. The crystal, Rose said suddenly, pulling it from her terminal. I managed to decrypt part of it. Dawn, you were right. The Council isn't just selling weapons, they're testing new ones. The border wars are their proving ground. Another explosion shook the station, closer this time. Warning klaxons blared as emergency containment fields activated throughout the sector. They were running out of time. This way, Rose directed, leading them through a maintenance hatch. The tunnel beyond was narrow and dark, designed for repair drones rather than people. They crawled through in single file, the sounds of fighting growing more distant. Once we reached the mining docks, Rose explained between breaths. There's an old survey ship. Not much to look at, but it's got good stealth systems. You can. A cutting beam suddenly pierced the tunnel wall ahead of them, molten metal spraying as elite guards began cutting their way in. They were trapped between the guards and the sealed hatch behind them. Any other exits? James asked, drawing his salvager's pistol, though he knew it would be useless against elite guard armor. Rose's cybernetic eyes scanned the tunnel walls. There's a waste disposal chute 2 meters back. Drops straight to the lower levels. But the fall would kill us, Dawn finished, her hair pulsing with worried purple light. Then her expression changed. Unless... James, do you trust me? He met her eyes in the dim tunnel. Yes. Dawn's hair suddenly blazed with brilliant light, brighter than they'd ever seen it. The crystalline strands extended outward, wrapping around all three of them in a cocoon of glowing energy. My people evolved in a high-gravity world, she explained quickly. Our bodies generate a natural field to compensate. I can extend it, but not for long. The cutting beam was almost through. James made the decision. Rose, the crystal? Rose handed it to Dawn. Get this to people who can use it. And good luck. James kicked open the waste chute's panel, revealing the dark shaft beyond. Dawn's hair field surrounded them in a protective bubble as they dropped into the abyss. The sensation was strange, like falling through thick liquid instead of air. They fell for what seemed like forever, Dawn's face strained with concentration as she maintained the field. Finally, they splashed down in a collection tank, Dawn's field cushioning their impact. They surfaced in foul-smelling but survivable conditions. "The mining docks should be one level up," Rose said, checking her cybernetic readouts. "But we've got company coming. The guards are tracking our life signs." Dawn stood shakily, drained from using her abilities. James supported her, noticing how her hair had dimmed to a weak glow. "You never mentioned you could do that," he said softly. "There's a lot about my people you don't know," she replied with a faint smile. Maybe someday I can show you our world. If we survive this." "When we survive this," James corrected, helping her toward the maintenance ladder. "But first, we need to get this evidence to someone who can use it. Someone with enough power to challenge the council." Rose's eyes whirred as she processed data. "I might know just the person. But reaching them, that's going to be the real challenge." Above them, elite guards were rappelling down the shaft. Time was running out, and Dawn was in no condition for another escape. They needed a plan, and fast. The mining dock's ancient survey ship hummed to life as James worked frantically at its controls. Behind them, the sounds of elite guard weapons fire grew closer. Dawn sat in the co-pilot's seat, her hair barely glowing now, while Rose connected her cybernetic systems to the ship's outdated computer. "The good news," Rose announced, "is that I've contacted my ally, the Border World's ambassador. She's waiting for us at the neutral station Unity Point." "The bad news?" She gestured at the dock's sealed doors. "Those aren't opening without station authority." James smiled grimly. "Who needs doors?" He punched several buttons on his console. "This is a mining survey ship. It's got drilling equipment." The ship's forward drill began to spin, its ancient motors protesting but still functional. The elite guards had reached their level now, their heavy boots echoing on metal walkways. "Hold on!" James called out. He fired the engines and drove the spinning drill straight into the dock's outer door. The sound was horrific, screeching metal and straining machinery, but the drill did its job. Space opened up before them, the sudden decompression helping to throw their ship clear of the station. "Multiple pursuit craft launching," Rose reported, her cybernetic eyes tracking the radar. "But they're not elite guard vessels. They're—" She paused. "They're Border World ships. Military grade." Dawn's hair flickered with surprise. "The Council is using Border World ships? Then—" Her eyes widened. "They're going to blame this on the Border Worlds. Start their war early." James pushed the survey ship's engines to their limit, but the pursuit craft were gaining. That's when Dawn sat up straighter, some strength returning to her voice. "The crystal," she said. "Rose, can you broadcast its contents? To everyone?" Rose's cybernetic eyes glowed brighter. "The station's communication array is still in range. I can bounce a signal through it to every ship in the sector. But the encryption is keyed to my genetic signature," Dawn finished. She pulled a shimmering strand of her hair, wincing slightly. "Use this. Quickly!" As Rose worked to broadcast the data, the pursuit ships opened fire. James weaved through the barrage, but their ship wasn't built for combat. A hit rocked their vessel, knocking out one engine. "Broadcasting now," Rose announced. The effect was almost immediate. The pursuit ships suddenly stopped firing, their pilots presumably seeing the evidence of their own leader's betrayal. Throughout the sector, ships of all kinds were receiving proof of the Council's corruption and warmongering. Dawn's hair began to glow brighter as she watched the broadcast indicators. "It's not just the evidence of weapons deals," she said softly. "The crystal contains everything: decades of manipulation, assassination orders, staged conflicts. The Council's entire dark history." More ships were appearing on their radar now, but these were Border World vessels, real ones this time. And they weren't alone. Ships from independent worlds, trader alliances, and even some bearing Council markings were converging on their position. "The Ambassador's fleet," Rose explained. She's been building a coalition, waiting for exactly this kind of evidence. The Council's control is breaking. James reached over and took Dawn's hand as they watched history unfold on their view screen. Her hair shimmered with colors he was beginning to recognize: hope, relief, and something else. Something warmer. So, he said, trying to sound casual, about that offer to show me your world. Dawn's hair glowed with soft pink light. I think that can be arranged. After all, we're going to need diplomatic representatives for the new government. Someone who understands both our peoples. Rose groaned. If you two are done making plans, the ambassador's ship is hailing us. Shall I put her through? James and Dawn shared a look, then nodded together. They had started this journey as fugitives, a human salvage pilot and an alien prisoner. They would finish it as something more, proof that when different species stood together, even the most powerful corruption could be overcome. As their damaged ship limped toward the ambassador's fleet, Dawn's hair created patterns of light that danced across the bridge. James watched the display, finally understanding what those colors meant. It wasn't just bioluminescence, it was a language of emotion, and right now it was telling a story of love, hope, and new beginnings. The galaxy would never be the same. And neither would they.